Russia is the largest nation on Earth, commanding a massive landmass that spans 11 time zones and 2 continents. Yet while the Kremlin's military focus remains heavily bleeding out on the battlefields of Eastern Europe, a catastrophic strategic vulnerability is opening up on its opposite flank. A territory larger than the continental United States is quietly drifting out of Moscow's orbit. This isn't happening through a massive kinetic invasion or a lightning blitzkrieg. It is happening because of a devastating demographic collapse and a total failure of state control. This is the Russian Far East, a vital geopolitical region covering 40% of Russia's entire territory, but home to barely 8 million people. That is just over 5% of Russia's total population, and those numbers are free-falling. Russian President Vladimir Putin has openly classified this population exodus as a direct threat to national security. From a military standpoint, he is absolutely correct. Historically, empires hold territory through a combination of boots on the ground, economic supply chains, and civilian presence. In the Far East, Russia is losing all three. Moscow's failure to maintain a stable populace creates a dangerous geopolitical vacuum. It opens the historical wound of 1860 when the Russian Empire seized Outer Manchuria from a weakened Qing dynasty. Today, the tables have turned. A demographic and economic inversion is underway, and the Russian armed forces are increasingly powerless to stop it. To understand the sheer scale of this strategic disaster, we must look at the hard data. According to the final Soviet census of 1989, the region held over 10.3 million residents. By the time Vladimir Putin solidified his grip on power, that number had slid to 8.8 million. Today, it languishes below 7.8 million, a staggering 25% loss of human capital in just over 3 decades. In peripheral military districts, the collapse is even more severe. Chukotka, facing Alaska across the Bering Strait, has lost nearly 70% of its population since 1991. Magadan Oblast, once the core of the Soviet resource extraction complex, has seen 63% of its citizens pack up and leave. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union maintained this harsh frontier through aggressive state subsidies. The Kremlin utilized both coercive gulag labor and massive financial incentives. Soviet workers in the Far East received wages up to twice the national average guaranteed housing vouchers back west and heavily subsidized state logistics. It was a calculated sacrifice: endure the brutal Siberian winters, build the state's strategic depth, and retire in comfort near Moscow or Leningrad. But when the Soviet Union imploded, those institutional guarantees vanished overnight. Savings were wiped out by hyperinflation. The rational choice for millions of citizens was to flee westward. Today, the crisis has evolved from a sudden panic into a permanent calculated reality. Living in the Russian Far East is now a losing mathematical equation. While wages carry a meager 18% premium over the national average, the cost of basic goods, heating, and food is up to 80% higher than in Western Russia. Furthermore, local healthcare networks have been consolidated and stripped down, driving life expectancy down by 3 full years compared to the national average. The young and capable leave, the elderly and impoverished stay behind. The ongoing war in Ukraine has turned this chronic illness into an acute fatal crisis. To sustain his grinding war of attrition in Europe, Putin has disproportionately mobilized working-age men from ethnic minority regions and economically depressed eastern provinces. The Far East has been stripped of its most critical demographic, the very laborers required to run heavy machinery, maintain rail lines, and operate mines. From a defense perspective, the war has effectively cannibalized Russia's eastern security architecture. The Eastern Military District has been systematically emptied of its best-trained personnel, modern T-80BV tanks, and advanced artillery units, all shipped thousands of miles west to be destroyed in the Donbass. This creates a terrifying logistical nightmare. The entire Russian Far East relies on a single, highly vulnerable umbilical cord, the Trans-Siberian Railway, and the Baikal-Amur main line. In a conventional conflict with a near-peer adversary in Asia, A few precision strikes on key tunnels or bridges would completely isolate the Russian Far East from Western reinforcement. Simultaneously, Western sanctions have crippled Russia's domestic aviation industry. Cut off from Boeing and Airbus parts, the regional air networks that keep remote Far Eastern towns connected are rapidly degrading. In late 2023, Moscow ambitiously claimed it would construct 1,000 domestic aircraft by 2030 to secure its internal transport routes. By 2025, exactly 13 aircraft left the assembly lines, forcing planners to quietly abandon the project. Russia can no longer reliably fly its citizens or its soldiers across its own empire. As Russian state capacity retreats, a hungry superpower is stepping into the void. Driven by its insatiable demand for raw materials, China is executing a textbook campaign of unrestricted economic warfare, slowly absorbing the Russian Far East without firing a single shot. Because of the war in Ukraine, Moscow now finds itself in a position of extreme geopolitical vassalage to Beijing. The price of this survival is paid in raw resources and territorial access. Chinese investments into the Far Eastern Federal District are skyrocketing toward the 1 trillion ruble mark. Trade volumes through regional border hubs like Khabarovsk grew by a staggering 36% in the first half of 2025 alone. The demographic contrast along the border is stunning. On the Russian side of the Amur River, there are 8 million starving, departing citizens. On the Chinese side, in the Dongbei region, there are over 100 million people looking for economic opportunities. An estimated 500,000 Chinese citizens now permanently reside within the Far Eastern District, utilizing visa-free economic zones originally designed by Moscow to attract domestic investment. Intelligence reports indicate that entire agricultural and timber extraction enclaves have formed where ethnic Russians are entirely absent from the workforce. Beijing hasn't forgotten that cities like Vladivostok and Khabarovsk were once known as Hai-Shinwai and Boli under Chinese sovereignty. Chinese state maps now legally require these historic names to be printed alongside the Russian ones. China does not need to launch a risky military invasion. They are simply buying the region piece by piece, hectare by hectare. Desperate to halt this demographic bleeding without angering Beijing, the Kremlin has resorted to an unorthodox and highly dangerous gamble, outsourcing its sovereign labor force to North Korea. Between 2024 and 2025, tens of thousands of North Korean laborers flooded into the Russian Far East under state-sanctioned contracts. Russian corporations have already requested over 150,000 additional North Korean workers to staff mining, logging, and construction sectors. These workers endure grueling, near-slavery conditions, working 18-hour shifts with virtually no days off. The vast majority of their hard currency wages are funneled directly back to Kim Jong-un's regime to fund Pyongyang's ballistic missile programs. This introduces a bizarre strategic dynamic. Russia is keeping its eastern territory economically functional by allowing two nuclear-armed neighbors to deeply entrench themselves inside its borders. Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service has aptly noted that Moscow is effectively paying for its war in the West by surrendering its sovereign territory in the East. This vacuum is also awakening internal political threats. As ethnic Russians flee the region, fringe political movements are resurfacing. Concepts like an independent United States of Siberia, which began as an abstract art movement, are slowly morphing into genuine expressions of regional discontent among local activists. While an armed secessionist movement is unlikely in the immediate future, any sudden fracture or weakness in Moscow's centralized authority could cause the Far East to break away entirely. The Russian Far East sits upon the world's most lucrative untapped reserves of timber, rare earth elements, gold, and hydrocarbons. It borders China, Japan, and sits mere miles from America's doorstep in Alaska. Yet Putin cannot convince his own people to defend it with their presence. The Kremlin continues to project the illusion of a global superpower reasserting imperial borders in Europe. But the cold, hard military reality is simpler. A state cannot call itself a great empire if it cannot even maintain its own population on its own land. The Russian Far East is changing, the demographic clock is ticking, and Moscow is completely powerless to stop it. To stay informed on the shifting balances of global military power and geopolitics, make sure to subscribe to Warfront Logic and hit the notification bell. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Can Russia hold its eastern flank, or is Siberia destined to fall into Beijing's hands? Thank you for watching.